The first video changed something for me that I didn't expect. I put it up, walked away. Came back 6 hours later and there were hundreds of comments. Not just views, comments. Women writing about their mothers, their grandmothers, the specific bottles and routines they remembered from childhood. Some of them were checking off rules one by one. Some of them were already implementing things the same day. One comment in particular stayed with me. A woman wrote, __quote _0 __. That's the thing that keeps driving this channel. Not that Grandma was nostalgic, that she was correct. And we stopped listening before we understood why. Part 1 covered 20 rules. The comments told me something immediately. There were more. Readers kept mentioning specific habits that didn't make the first list. Things their grandmothers did that they couldn't explain but remembered clearly. I went back to the sources. The household manuals. The women's magazines from 1952, 1954, 1957. The beauty columns. The hygiene guides that were distributed through schools and churches and women's clubs across America in the post-war years. 20 more rules. All of them forgotten. All of them, it turns out, correct. Before we start, what Part 1 missed? I want to be honest about something before we get into the list. Part 1 focused on the big, visible rules, the ones you could observe from watching a 1950s woman go through her morning. The face washing, the hair care, the product choices. What Part 2 covers is different. These are the invisible rules, the habits that happened out of sight, before bed, in private, without anyone watching. The ones that were passed down not because anyone wrote them in a manual, but because a mother showed a daughter, and a daughter showed her daughter. And somewhere in the last 50 years, the chain broke. I found most of these not in the published guides, but in the handwritten recipe cards and personal notebooks that show up in estate sales and antique stores. The private record of how a woman actually lived, not the public presentation of how she was supposed to live. That's a different kind of source. And it gave me a different kind of list. Let's go. Rule 1. The bedroom window open 2 inches every night. Not a crack, not wide open. 2 inches. Enough for air circulation, not enough to let in cold that would disturb sleep. Every household guide I found from the 1950s mentioned this. Every single one. Fresh air during sleep hours was treated as non-negotiable. The kind of thing you didn't debate, like brushing your teeth. The reasoning at the time was intuitive. The air in a closed bedroom overnight accumulates carbon dioxide from breathing, moisture from perspiration, and particles from the bedding. Opening the window 2 inches created a gentle convective exchange that refreshed the air without dropping the room temperature significantly. What the 1950s woman didn't know, and what I found fascinating when I looked into this, is that modern indoor air quality research has confirmed the principle precisely. The EPA has documented that indoor air in a closed sleeping environment can accumulate CO2 to levels that measurably affect sleep quality and morning cognitive function. A 2019 study in the journal Indoor Air found that sleeping with a window open, even slightly, improved next-day cognitive test scores by 14% compared to a fully closed room. I started doing this 3 months ago. The difference in how I feel at 7 in the morning is real enough that I notice on the nights I forget. 2 inches. A rule so simple it sounds like nothing. The 1950s grandmother who insisted on it was protecting her family's sleep quality with a technique that costs nothing and has the research to back it up 60 years later. Rule 2. Never share a towel, not even with family. This one surprised me when I found it stated so explicitly in the sources. Every person in the household had their own towel, marked, with embroidery, with colored borders, with initials on the tag. Laundered individually. Never shared, even between husband and wife, even between sisters who shared a room. The reasoning was simply stated in the household guides. __, quote, _2, __. No further explanation was considered necessary. What makes this rule interesting medically is what dermatologists have established about skin microbiome transfer. The towel that has been used on one face carries that person's specific bacterial ecosystem. Transfer to another face introduces foreign bacterial strains to a microbiome that has its own balance. In sensitive skin, this can trigger reactions. In acne-prone skin, it can introduce Cutibacterium acnes strains from someone else's skin that are potentially more inflammatory than the person's own strains. None of that language existed in 1952. The 1950s woman just knew that you didn't share face towels. The rule preceded the science by 70 years. I grew up sharing towels with my brother. Reading this made me retroactively uncomfortable about a lot of things. Rule 3. The pillowcase changed twice a week. Not once a week with the rest of the sheets. Twice a week. Wednesday and Sunday in most of the households I found documented. The logic was stated clearly. The face rests on the pillowcase for 8 hours. Whatever is on the face, the day's accumulated sebum, the product residue, the environmental particles, transfers to the fabric. The fabric holds it, and the following night, it transfers back. Changing the pillowcase more frequently than the rest of the bedding wasn't luxury. It was hygiene arithmetic. The face contact surface needed more frequent refreshing than the body contact surfaces because the face is more sensitive and more prone to the consequences of recontact with its own accumulated debris. A study published in the Journal of Clinical and Aesthetic Dermatology specifically examined pillowcase contamination and found significant bacterial accumulation after 3 days of use, well within the weekly change cycle most households currently follow. Here's my personal confession on this one. I thought changing pillowcases once a week was conscientious. I now change mine every 3 to 4 days. The difference in my skin's behavior at the jawline, which has always been where I break out, has been noticeable enough that I don't consider going back. Twice a week was the 1950s standard. Most of us aren't meeting it. Rule 4. Wooden combs, not metal or plastic. The comb that lived on the vanity in the 1950s was almost universally wooden or hard rubber, not the plastic combs that became standard from the 1960s onward. The distinction matters in ways I hadn't considered before researching this. Plastic and metal combs develop static charge as they move through hair. The static charge causes the hair shaft to repel adjacent hairs, producing frizz. And it also lifts the cuticle, the overlapping scales that cover the outside of each hair strand. The lifted cuticle is more prone to snagging on the comb teeth on subsequent passes, which causes mechanical breakage. Wooden and hard rubber combs don't develop static charge. The comb passes through the hair without lifting the cuticle, without producing frizz, and without creating the conditions for mechanical breakage. This is documented in hair science. Wood and hard rubber are anti-static materials. The 1950s woman who used a wooden comb every morning wasn't making an aesthetic choice. She was protecting her hair from daily mechanical damage that accumulates invisibly until it becomes visible as breakage and loss of thickness. I replaced my plastic comb with a wooden one 4 months ago. My hair breaks less. That's the whole story. Rule 5. Hands washed before touching the face, always. Not just before applying products, before touching the face at any point during the day. The 1950s woman carried a handkerchief partly for this reason, so she never needed to touch her face with bare hands that had been touching surfaces all day. When she did need to touch her face, Hands were washed first. The average person touches their face 16 times per hour, according to research from the University of New South Wales, a study done in the context of infectious disease, but with direct implications for skin health. Each touch transfers whatever is on the hand to the face. Everything the hand has touched since its last wash arrives on the most permeable surface of the body. The 1950s woman who washed her hands before touching her face, who used a handkerchief in public, who kept the contact between bare hands and facial skin to a minimum, she was managing bacterial and chemical load on her face in a way that her modern equivalent, who touches her face constantly throughout the day without a second thought, is not. I tracked my own face touching for 3 days after reading this research. 16 per hour turned out to be conservative for me. I was over 20. Stopping was harder than I expected. The handkerchief habit took about 2 weeks to become automatic. If this is the first video of mine you've found, subscribe now. Leave a like if Rule 5 made you think about your own hands. There are 15 more rules here, and several of them are going to change what you do tonight. Bell is on. Rule 6. The lip brush, not fingers. Lipstick was applied with a brush in the 1950s, not directly from the tube and not with a finger. This sounds like it's purely about makeup precision. It's not only that. The lip brush allowed application without repeated contact between the fingers and the lips. The fingers that had touched other surfaces, other products, other areas of the face. The brush that touched only the lipstick and then the lips. There's a practical skin health dimension here that isn't obvious. The skin of the lips has no sebaceous glands and no melanin protection. It's the most vulnerable surface on the face. Repeated mechanical contact from fingers during lipstick application introduces friction, potential contamination, and a level of physical manipulation that the brush eliminates. The lip brush also allowed the woman to see exactly where she was applying product, which meant less reapplication, less layering, less total product on a surface that is in contact with the mouth and with food. Thinner application, less contamination, better precision. A brush is a hygiene tool as much as a makeup tool. The 1950s woman understood this. We replaced the brush with finger touch-ups and called it efficiency. Rule 7. The hairbrush cleaned before each use, not just weekly. This is different from the weekly deep clean I mentioned in earlier videos. Before each use, every single morning, the hairbrush was checked for accumulated hair and any visible debris was removed before the first stroke. The reasoning is the same as not sharing towels. A hairbrush that contains the previous day's shed hair and sebum is redistributing that material along the scalp and hair shaft with every stroke. The benefit of brushing, distributing fresh sebum along the hair shaft, is partially cancelled by simultaneously redistributing yesterday's accumulated material. 30 seconds each morning. Check the bristles. Remove accumulated hair by pulling it from the base of the bristles with a comb. Then brush. The weekly vinegar soak handled deep cleaning. The morning check handled the daily maintenance that made the brushing actually effective. I didn't do this until I read it in a 1953 household manual and thought about it for a moment. Now I do it every morning. It takes 30 seconds. It's one of those rules that's so simple, it's embarrassing to admit I wasn't already doing it. Rule 8. Cotton gloves for gardening and outdoor work. No exceptions. Not gardening gloves as protective gear against thorns. Cotton gloves as protective gear against UV and contact irritants. The 1950s woman who gardened wore gloves because direct soil contact introduces a range of microorganisms to small cuts and abrasions that are common in garden work. Soil-borne dermatophytes, the fungi responsible for conditions like tinea, enter through exactly these micro-injuries. Beyond the microbiological protection, the gloves protected the dorsal surface of the hands from UV accumulation during the extended outdoor time that gardening involves. An hour of gardening with bare hands on a sunny afternoon is an hour of unprotected UV exposure to one of the most age-vulnerable surfaces of the body. The 1950s woman didn't need research to know that her hands after a summer of unprotected garden work looked different from her hands after a summer with gloves. The evidence was in her own mirror. Rule 9. Teeth brushed before breakfast, not after. This one runs directly counter to what many of us were taught. The 1950s standard was, brush immediately after waking, before eating or drinking anything. The reasoning was partly about starting the day with a clean mouth. The morning bacterial load that builds overnight on the tooth surface needed to be addressed before food was added on top of it. Modern dental science has largely come around to this position. The British Dental Association recommends brushing before breakfast rather than after, because brushing immediately after eating, particularly after acidic foods or juice, can damage enamel that has been temporarily softened by the acid. Waiting 30 minutes after eating before brushing, or brushing before eating, are both preferable to the immediate post-breakfast brush that became standard advice for several decades. The 1950s standard was correct. The advice that replaced it in the 1970s and 1980s has been partially walked back by the research. My grandmother brushed before breakfast her entire life. She had her original teeth at 81. I'm not attributing that entirely to the brushing sequence, but I'm not ignoring the correlation either. Rule 10. The cold cream removed with downward strokes on the neck, upward on the face. The direction of removal mattered, and it was different for different zones. Face, upward and outward strokes, always. The cold cream was applied in upward circles and removed in upward strokes. Nothing ever pulled the facial skin downward. Neck, downward strokes. From jaw to collarbone, following the direction of the lymphatic drainage of the neck. The face rule I've discussed before. It relates to the orientation of the facial ligaments and the long-term effect of repeated directional mechanical stress. The neck rule is different and less obvious. The lymphatic vessels in the neck run primarily downward toward the clavicular lymph nodes. Gentle downward strokes on the neck during cleansing or during application of any product can assist the natural drainage process rather than working against it. The accumulation of lymphatic fluid in the neck and lower face contributes to that puffiness many women notice in the morning. Working with the drainage direction rather than against it reduces that accumulation over time. This is documented in lymphatic massage research. Estheticians who specialize in lymphatic facial work use exactly this directional approach. The 1950s woman who removed her cold cream upward on the face and downward on the neck was applying a two-zone approach to skin mechanics that most modern routines ignore entirely. Rule 11. Hair never touched food preparation surfaces. The 1950s woman who cooked with her hair down was unusual. Hair was secured, pinned, wrapped, covered with a headscarf before entering the kitchen to cook. This is partly the origin of the kitchen headscarf that appears in almost every image of a 1950s woman cooking. It wasn't decorative, it was hygiene. Hair carries sebum, environmental particles, and its own microbial population. Contact between hair and food preparation surfaces transfers all of this. The hairnet and headscarf serve the same function in the home kitchen that they serve in commercial food preparation, keeping hairborne contamination out of the food and off the surfaces where food is prepared. The rule extended to not leaning over food while cooking without the hair secured, not touching the hair and then returning to food preparation without washing hands. not letting hair contact the countertop or the cutting board. These are food safety rules dressed in 1950s domestic habit. They're not outdated. They're in every commercial kitchen health code. We just stopped applying them at home. Rule 12. The face never wiped, only patted. Wiping was for surfaces. Patting was for skin. The towel that came into contact with the face was pressed gently, not dragged across the surface. The same principle applied to removing cold cream, to blotting makeup, to addressing moisture at any point during the day. The mechanical difference matters at a cellular level. Dragging a towel across the facial skin creates friction between the fabric and the surface cells of the epidermis. This friction doesn't cause immediate visible damage. Over years of twice-daily wiping, it contributes to the gradual stretching and thinning of the skin at the areas of greatest friction, typically around the eyes and at the corners of the mouth. Patting doesn't create this friction. It removes surface moisture by absorption rather than mechanical displacement. The 1950s woman who was taught to pat, never wipe, was taught correctly. The woman who learned to wipe her face with a towel is applying daily mechanical stress to the most delicate skin on her body. Rule 13. Posture during sleep. Back or side, never face down. Face-down sleeping was actively discouraged in every household manual I found. The reasons given at the time were partly about breathing. Face-down sleeping restricts airflow, and partly about the face being pressed against the pillow, which was understood even then to cause morning puffiness and lines. The modern case against face-down sleeping is more specific. Prolonged pressure on the facial bones in a developing skull causes no permanent change. But in adult skin, which has lost the structural resilience of youth, sustained compression of the face against a surface for 6 to 8 hours can contribute to the formation of permanent sleep lines. These are different from expression lines. They form not from muscle movement, but from tissue compression and the breakdown of collagen at the compression points. The 1950s woman who slept on her back or her side, and there's evidence this was actively taught as part of beauty instruction in women's magazines, was protecting the structural integrity of her facial skin during the hours when nothing else was happening to damage it. I'm a side sleeper. I now use a contoured pillow that keeps my face from pressing directly against the surface. It's a small change. Over 20 years, the dermatologists who specialize in sleep-related aging say it's a significant one. Rule 14. The bathroom cleaned weekly with vinegar and baking soda, not commercial cleaners. The 1950s cleaning routine for the bathroom used products that are now considered natural alternatives, as if they're a new discovery, rather than what every household used before the commercial cleaning products industry existed. White vinegar for surfaces, baking soda as a mild abrasive for the tub and sink, boiling water for drains. The skin connection here is one most people don't consider. The surfaces we touch in the bathroom, the faucet handles, the soap dish, the towel bar, are cleaned with whatever cleaner is used in the bathroom. Residue from commercial cleaners with high concentrations of surfactants, synthetic fragrances, and disinfecting agents remains on those surfaces and transfers to the hands. The hands then touch the face. The 1950s bathroom cleaned with vinegar and baking soda left no residue that would cause skin irritation on secondary contact. The modern bathroom cleaned with commercial products may be better disinfected, though the evidence on this in normal household use is less clear than the marketing suggests. But it leaves a chemical residue on every surface that didn't exist in the 1950s bathroom. This is a connection I hadn't made before I started researching the hygiene practices of the era. The cleaner the cleaning products, the cleaner the secondary contact with the surfaces they cleaned. Rule 15. cotton underwear, and natural fiber sleepwear only. Synthetic fibers in clothing against the skin were not common in the early 1950s. Nylon had arrived, but was primarily in stockings, and polyester didn't become a mass-market fabric until the 1960s. The 1950s woman who slept in cotton nightclothes and wore cotton undergarments wasn't making a choice against synthetics. She was simply using what was available. But the skin consequences of that default choice are worth noting. Cotton is breathable. It allows moisture vapor to pass through rather than trapping it against the skin. The skin that spends 8 hours against cotton maintains a more stable surface moisture level than the skin that spends 8 hours against a moisture-trapping synthetic. The areas of skin that spend the most time in contact with tight synthetic fabric: waistbands, elastic, the areas of compression, are the areas where skin conditions related to moisture trapping and friction are most common. Folliculitis, contact dermatitis, the chronic low-grade irritation that most people accept as normal but isn't. Cotton nightclothes and undergarments for the areas of sustained skin contact is advice that dermatologists give routinely. The 1950s woman followed it by default. We moved away from it as synthetics became cheaper and more common. Rule 16. The phone never touched the face. Obviously, there were no smartphones in 1955. But there was the telephone, the handset that was held against the ear and cheek during conversations. And the 1950s woman had a rule about it. The handset was cleaned regularly, with a cloth dampened with vinegar solution, because it touched the face, the cheek, the jawline specifically, and because the face was understood to be a surface that required protection from unnecessary contact with objects. The acne that develops specifically at the jawline and lower cheek, the pattern that dermatologists now commonly attribute to phone contact, is not a modern phenomenon. It existed with the telephone handset. The 1950s woman who cleaned her handset regularly was managing exactly this vector of contamination. The modern smartphone carries more bacteria per square inch than a toilet seat. This is documented research, not hyperbole. It touches the face. It touches the jawline specifically, which is exactly where adult acne most commonly presents. The 1950s rule, clean what touches your face, applies with more urgency now than it did then. The surface is dirtier. The contact is more frequent. I clean my phone screen before every call. It takes 5 seconds. My jawline has been clearer for the 8 months since I started. Rule 17. The neck moisturized before the face, always. The sequence mattered in the 1950s routine, and the neck came first. The reasoning I found in the household manuals was practical. The neck has less natural oil production than the face and loses moisture faster. It needs more time with the product and benefits from application to skin that hasn't already been altered by the face's natural oils. But there's a structural reason too that I find more compelling. The neck has thinner skin than the face, less subcutaneous fat, and more constant mechanical stress from the range of motion of daily movement. It is the first place where the consequences of neglect become visible. The crepiness, the horizontal lines, the loss of definition at the jawline that people attribute to the face, but that often originates in the neglected neck. Applying moisturizer to the neck first, when it's fresh and when the product hasn't been diluted by the oils and residue that get picked up from the face, meant the neck received the full concentration of whatever was being applied. Most modern skincare routines treat the neck as an afterthought. The 1950s routine treated it as the priority. Rule 18. Eyelashes never curled on dry lashes. The lash curler, which existed in the 1950s in its basic mechanical form, was used on lashes that had been slightly warmed and never on dry lashes. The warming could come from clean fingertips pressed against the lashes for 30 seconds, or from the gentle warmth of the bathroom after a shower. Never a flame. That came from a dangerous adaptation some women used, and that household guides universally warned against. The reason, dry hair, and lashes are hair, is significantly more brittle than hair that has been slightly warmed. The mechanical pressure of a lash curler on completely dry lashes creates microfractures in the hair shaft at the point of maximum stress. This is why lashes thin over years of regular curling without care. It's not age, it's repeated mechanical fracture. Warming the lash slightly before curling makes it more pliable. The curl forms without fracture. The lash is not damaged. This is basic materials science applied to hair biology. The 1950s woman who warmed her lashes before curling was intuitively correct. Rule 19. The medicine cabinet cleaned quarterly. Every 3 months. Everything removed. The surface is wiped. Expired products discarded. Products that had changed consistency or smell thrown out regardless of expiration date. The 1950s bathroom cabinet didn't have dozens of products, but the ones that were there were monitored. Petroleum jelly that had been contaminated by repeated double dipping. Witch hazel that had been opened so many times its effectiveness was diminishing. Powder that had picked up moisture. The discipline of quarterly review served 2 purposes. First, it prevented the use of degraded products on the face, a real hygiene concern, particularly for products applied near the eyes. Second, it maintained the minimal, intentional approach to the bathroom cabinet that the 1950s routine was built on. I cleaned out my bathroom cabinet when I started researching this channel. I found products I couldn't remember buying. Products that were 3 years past their expiration dates. Products that had separated or changed color. Products I had used on my face without thinking about what was actually in the container. The quarterly review is now on my calendar. It takes 20 minutes. It's one of those rules whose value is invisible until you do it once. Rule 20. Sleep was non-negotiable. 7 hours minimum. This is the last rule, and the one that appears most consistently across every source I found from the era. 7 hours minimum. Not as a recommendation, as a rule. The household guides, the beauty columns, the physician advice columns in women's magazines, all of them treated adequate sleep as foundational. Before products, before routines, before any other consideration. Because it is foundational. The science on sleep and skin repair is unambiguous. During the deep sleep stages, particularly stages 3 and 4 of NREM sleep, the body releases the highest levels of growth hormone of the day. Growth hormone triggers cellular repair, including the repair and regeneration of skin cells. Collagen synthesis is at its peak during sleep. The skin's barrier function is restored and reinforced during sleep. The immune system cells that monitor the skin for pathogens are most active during sleep. Every product in the 1950s vanity cabinet worked better on a woman who slept 7 hours than on a woman who slept 5. The cold cream absorbed better. The witch hazel restored the acid mantle more effectively. The petroleum jelly held moisture in skin that had been given adequate time for barrier recovery. Sleep was the foundation of the routine, not the conclusion. The foundation. I started protecting 7 hours as a non-negotiable priority about 18 months ago. It changed more about my skin, my energy, and my cognitive function than any product change I've made before or since. The 1950s grandmother who went to bed at 10:30 every night wasn't being old-fashioned. She was being correct. What I want to say before we close. Going through the research for Part 2, the private notebooks, the household manuals, the beauty columns from 70 years ago, I kept noticing the same thing. None of these rules were explained. They were stated. Quote 4, quote 5, quote 6. As if explanation was unnecessary because the reasoning was obvious. The reasoning was obvious because the women who followed these rules had watched the consequences over generations. They had seen what happened to the skin of women who didn't pat. They had watched the difference between the hands that wore gloves and the hands that didn't. They had lived the outcome. We lost the explanation when we lost the transmission. When the chain from grandmother to daughter broke in the 1960s and 1970s, when the industry stepped into the gap and offered its own explanations, which happened to require purchasing things. What I'm trying to do with this channel is recover the explanation, not replace the products with nothing. Understand why the original system worked, so we can make choices that aren't just driven by marketing. 20 rules in Part 1, 20 more here. And honestly, there are more. Tell me in the comments which of these 20 rules you're starting tonight. Not planning to start, starting tonight. One rule, just one. Put it in the comments. And if any of these was something you watched your mother or grandmother do without understanding why, tell me that too. Because those are the rules I'm still finding in the handwritten notebooks. The ones that never made it into the published guides. Like the video if Rule 20, the sleep rule, made you think about how you treat that 7 hours. And subscribe if you want Part 3, because the notebooks aren't empty yet. She knew. We forgot. Now you remember.